I was looking at some of the non-canonical Gospels yesterday, the Gospel according to Thomas and the Gospel of the Essenes, which are both really interesting bits of books. The Gospel of Thomas is part of the Nag Hammadi texts. Not quite sure where the Gospel of the Essenes comes from, and I don't think the translation was very good that I was looking at. It was really interesting though, really interesting. And there was some stuff in, I think it was the Gospel of the Essenes, that was talking, well, two things actually. One was a bit from the Gospel of John, or a kind of reworking of the Gospel of John, which was in the Gospel of the Essenes. But I think the other was in the Gospel of Thomas. But the thing that was in the Gospel of there was a rewrite of the Gospel according to John, which was in the Gospel of the Essenes, was the first passage of that. Because if you know John, I'm sure you do, it begins very famously with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and it goes on. But in my version of the Gospel of the Essenes, it doesn't say word, it says law. In the beginning was the law, and the law was with God, and the law was God. Now, as I say, I don't know if that translation is good, but it says that. I have to say I didn't like it as much as I liked word. I think word is much more interesting. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's much, to my mind, much more interesting. If for no other reason than I think words and language are much closer to the condition of words and language, how language and words work in relation to things like thought and the natural world, thought and being in our most intimate sense of being, and that thing we call the natural world of scientific truths and all these kind of the stuff of that world is better connected via considerations of word and language, to my mind, than they are by considerations of something like law. Law is really interesting, and it figures within scientific discourse, and it features within kind of civil and legal discourses. But it doesn't, for me, law doesn't really capture what it is to be alive and awake in quite the same way that word does. And that might be just my opinion, but that's just me, isn't it? So I much prefer John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. I think that is much more redolent than the word law, which kind of leads me on to the second bit, which I think was in Thomas, but it might have been the Gospel of the Essenes, which is to do with blasphemy. And there's a bit in there where I think it's I can't remember the exact context, but it's Jesus saying something. Oh, it must be Thomas actually, because it begins with Jesus said. In there, Jesus is saying what blasphemy is, and he's saying, if you insult me, if you can't remember the exact word, the phrase used, but if you blaspheme against me, it's not a problem. He's basically saying, and if you blaspheme against my Father, if you blaspheme against God, that's not a problem. But he says if you blaspheme against the Holy Spirit, that's a problem. So you can blaspheme against the Son, you can blaspheme against the Father, but you're not supposed to blaspheme against the Holy Spirit in this particular passage. Now I was thinking, what does that mean? What kind of an interpretation can I get out of that? How can I read that? And for me, I guess because I've been reading it in concert with this other thing to do with the beginning of John, about word, God, word, consciousness, word, life, word, all that kind of stuff. Because I'm thinking in those terms, I'm thinking, is there a way I can read into this passage about blasphemy, which uses the concept of the word and thought and language, consciousness, the world at large, being itself? And I think, for me, this is how it is, but this is probably bogus. It's just my interpretation right now. But if you think of this, the Holy Trinity there, the Holy Spirit, God the Father, and Jesus, God the Son. If you think about that Holy Trinity, then played out as a metaphor for certain kinds of language and thought, what you get there, I think, is something like Jesus being an utterance. Jesus is the Word made kind of flesh, or at least rendered as compression waves in the atmosphere. This is an utterance. The sentences I'm saying now are kind of like Jesus. In that metaphor. And of course you can blaspheme against them. You can deny me. You can deny the truth of these words. and you probably should, quite frankly. But you can deny that, and you may be right. There's no harm in that. There's nothing wrong with your denying the truth of my words, or arguing against them, or mocking my words. There's no problem with that. It doesn't undermine the fabric of our society, or our being, or the truth of the world at large, does it? That's fine. But if Jesus is the utterance, then God, the Father, would be the language. Something like lang as opposed to parole in linguistic terms. As opposed to the individual utterance, God would be the ocean of meaning that constitutes language. In my case, the English language, the rules of grammar and syntax that I'm speaking, how semantics works, why these particular noises mean these particular things, and why I'm putting them in these particular orders, and the kinds of things that it's possible to articulate with this language that I'm using right now, which might not be possible in quite the same way by other languages, because languages do shape the world slightly differently, don't they? And again, you can, just kind of playing that back into this fragment from the Gospel according to Thomas, as Jesus says, you can mock God. You can mock the utterance, you can mock God, the language, you can take the piss out of my language if you like, or you can draw attention to it, or you can debate it, or you can blaspheme against it. You can say, look, the English language is crap, the English language is not capable of doing these things. The English language carves the world up at these joints and misses out these other joints. You don't have words for these things, you can't express these things in the English language, or possibly in any language. Our languages are constrained by our embodiment in many ways. I don't have words or ways of conceiving in language a lot of the aspects of the universe that even something like simple as science describes. So I know that all human languages are limited and are shaped and shot through with metaphor and so on. So of course you can blaspheme against language itself. There's no problem with that. But then again, there's the idea of language, which I'm taking to be the representative of the Holy Spirit in that particular Trinity. Jesus is the utterance, the parole. The language itself is the God, the lang. But the idea of language, the idea of communion and communication, is the Holy Spirit in this one, the soul of the phenomenological world that we share through our thoughts and communications and utterances. And that's hard to undermine. If you start undermining, I'm not saying you should be burned in hell as a result of this, but undermining even the idea of language, the idea that we might be able to create some kind of sense, however contingent and temporary it might be, then that becomes incomprehensible. It isn't, I wouldn't say a sin in that kind of understanding of blasphemy, but I do think it's an incoherent, starts to be an incoherent thing to say. It destroys its own sense. Because how would you say it? How would you undermine the idea of language itself, and language and thought, and the relationships between language and thought, and my feeling of being here, exactly here, precisely now, alive and awake in this lane in Cornwall, listening to the sound of the birds, and that whole experience being framed by my mind, which I'm calling mind because I have the word my in my vocabulary, and because I have the word mind in my vocabulary, the whole thing is shot through with the idea of language. So that's my rudimentary and partial interpretation so far of that little bit from the Gospel of Thomas. You can blaspheme against Jesus, you can blaspheme against God, but it doesn't make any sense to blaspheme against the Holy Spirit of language itself.